Bon appetit and welcome to the Off Menu podcast with Ed Gamble and James Acaster. Bon appetitio and welcome to the Off Menu podcast with Ed Gamble and James Acaster.
Hello and welcome to Off Menu with me, Ed Gamble, and who's that over there? Jingle Bells Boxing Day Off Menu podcast. Hello. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast, and may I be the first to say Happy New Year. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast, the podcast that sounds so tasty you could eat it. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. I really wish you'd stop doing that. Oh no. It's the Off Menu podcast. Tuck your napkin into your collar because it's time for the Off Menu podcast. Hello and welcome to the Off Menu podcast. The podcast that is food. Get that cutlery ready. It's time for the Off Menu podcast. Bon appetitio and
yeah.
Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. It's the Off Menu podcast. 2 spoons with the podcast, please. We'll be splitting this one. Hello and welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Did someone order a podcast? Well, here is one of the podcasts that you've ordered. It's the Off Menu podcast. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. That's the dinner bell. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Oh,
boy.
Is that some tummies rumbling that I hear? Your order's ready. Your order's ready. It's another Off Menu podcast. Put us on a medium heat. For 1 hour approximately, you got yourself a hot podcast. Well, pull up a chair and tuck your napkin into your collar. It's the Off Menu podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. I don't mind carving. The podcast's ready. Take it out of the oven and leave it to rest. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. James, Ed, dinner's ready. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Have you washed your hands, young man? Because we're about to listen to the Off Menu podcast. What's that sizzle? Why, it's another hot podcast. Oh, is that your tummy rumbling, I hear? Then it must be time for the Off Menu podcast. And if you just leave that in the fun oven for about half an hour and sprinkle over a little bit of love, you've got yourself an excellent podcast. Excuse me, could you bring me another spoon? This one's a little bit dirty. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. I'm going to need oven gloves to touch that podcast. It's burning hot. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Could I just get the rest of this podcast to take away, please? Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. So we'll just take this podcast with 2 spoons to share, please. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Ding dong. Oh, the takeaway's here. What's it going to be? It's the Off Menu podcast. We'll be going Dutch on this one. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. And if you cook the podcast just for 2 minutes on each side, you can make sure that the centre is really funny. Would you like black pepper with that, sir? No, thank you. It's the Off Menu podcast. On the menu? I don't think so. It's off menu. What's that sizzle? Is it a pan of bacon? No. It's the sizzling chat of the Off Menu podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. If it's not delivered within 30 minutes or less, you get your money back. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. If it was on a curry menu, it would have 3 chilies after it. Oh, I've just realised the podcast's still in the oven. It's perfect. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Oh. And then just at the last minute, you whack the heat right up and you are guaranteed a very crispy podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Does anyone here at the table have any allergies? Oh yes, I'm allergic to bad podcasts. Don't worry, that won't be a problem. Welcome to the Off Menu podcast. Oh no, I forgot about the podcast in the oven. I think it's burning. Oh, actually, no, it's fine. It's perfect.
Wonderful stuff.
Welcome to, I really went into character there. Oh, here we are again. Your tummies are rumbling. I can't think of an intro.
Oh, it's a sad day.
Well, we've not recorded one.
Finally, it happens.
I'll be honest, we've not recorded one in a while, and I forgot that part of my job was coming up with a natty intro. And then I remembered halfway through saying, here we are again, and I came up with our tummies are rumbling, which is real bad.
Yeah, you really tried to claw it back. I was like, what's going on here?
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I know. And now I'm touching my face like a sort of stricken person.
Yep.
And cut directly into the podcast and you'll just see the chat ooze out. And if you just warm the spirit of good chat, pour that over the top of the podcast, you can set it alight for a very fancy start to the listening experience. Is that all right? Welcome to the Off Menu podcast, the spiciest podcast
on the market. High on the Scoville scale, leave the seeds in, they're the best bit.
And this podcast was first bottled in 1968, and you're very lucky to be getting it from deep in the cellar.
And if you just dash in some humour and then put that in a bowl, pop a wet tea towel over it, leave that to rise, you've got yourself the beginnings of a lovely podcast.
I want to get one of those off-menu podcasts. Stack them high, too. I want a double off-menu podcast and cover it, and I mean cover it with good humor. That's all I want. I want a double-stacked off-menu podcast covered with humor. I love that podcast. It's so delicious. And wrap it all up in a love bun.
Thank you, strange man.
Okay, bye!
Bye.
Ooh, this podcast looks delicious. Could you grate some extra humour over the top? Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. When the humour and chat is mixed together perfectly, it rises like an audio souffle.
My top tip would be don't touch your eyes after you've chopped this podcast because it's pretty hot.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the podcast so explosive that you have to prick it with a fork before you put it in the oven.
And the way we make this hot podcast is we slice open the butt of your ears, we pop in the sausage of chat, and then we cover it all over with humor ketchup. It's called the Off Menu Special. Welcome to Off Menu.
And if you just sniff the podcast, you can really tell how much love's gone into it.
Yeah, could I get my podcast toasted with a schmear of humour, please? Of course you can, sir. But we have a name for that here. It's called the Off Menu Podcast. And you've got to expose the podcast to some hot chat, comedy heat, and then leave it to rest for 10 minutes to make sure it's succulent in the middle. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
Excuse me, I found a hair in my podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
And the secret is you add just a little dash of milk to make this the creamiest podcast on the internet.
And if you just swirl the podcast around in your ears, it gets more air to it and it tastes a lot better.
How would you like your podcast cooked, sir? Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
And there's actually only a small portion of this podcast that you can enjoy. The rest is deadly poisonous.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the only cure for brain freeze. Ooh, look at the steam coming off that podcast. Give a little blow and crack on. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
And I would recommend poking the top of this podcast with a spoon to let some of the steam out because it's so hot.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the podcast that's been marinated for 24 hours in humour and good times. After touching this podcast, don't then touch your eyes or genitals because it's hot, baby. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, warming the kernels of chat and popping them into the corn of good times. It's a food podcast.
And the good thing about this podcast is we flambe it tableside. It may look like meat, it may taste like meat, but it's not meat. It's a podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, James. Are you sure you want a pint of that podcast? The percentage of humour is very high. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. And you can actually enjoy this podcast raw because it's of the highest quality.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the only food podcast on the internet that's been buried and cooked for 24 hours in Soft Touch's garden. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the podcast that's so cool you have to get it out the freezer for about 10 minutes before you even try to put a spoon in it. Don't shake up this podcast or it will explode in your face. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast with Ed Gamble and James Acaster. Now, if you swallow this podcast whole, you won't get the full flavour of it, so it's one bite and then down. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
If you froth up this podcast, you can actually turn it into a podaccino.
Lovely stuff.
Yeah, don't cut the mould off. That's the flavour of the podcast. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
So, welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, where we take the carcass of humour, the water of chat, and the herbs of friendship and apply the heat of the internet to create flavoursome podcast stock.
Turn the microphones up to high and listen to the sizzle of great chat. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast.
I'll have the off-menu special burger, please. You know what that means? It's triple layered. Humor, chat, and food. Triple decker, baby. The off-menu burger for the Off Menu Podcast. Live from New York City.
put a skewer into this podcast and it's coming out clean. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast with me, Ed Gamble. And who's that over there? Why, it's James Acaster. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. If it looks a little bit open, tap it on the table. If it closes, it's fresh content. James is a food podcast. That was an oyster-based introduction. You know that, of course.
Of course.
Let me reach into my big Christmas sack and see what's nestled within. Oh, it's the Off Menu Podcast. Here we are. It's Christmas. Let's have a big snog under the digital mistletoe. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast Christmas special. Here we are. I came up with an intro, James, about creme brulee, and then I realised it was the Christmas special, and I probably should have come up with a Christmassy intro.
Yes, yeah. You need a festive intro, really.
You need a festive intro. Pulling the cracker of chat and reading the joke of food, putting on the crown of humour.
I was maybe going to say, like, Christmas time, podcasts and wine.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, fallen off the bone and into your ears. How do you like your podcasts? Scrambled, fried, poached, or off menu? It's the Off Menu Podcast with Ed Gamble and James Acaster.
And don't forget, after you've listened to it, you've got to let this podcast rest to get the full, juicy listening flavour. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast with me, Ed Gamble.
And me, James Acaster, if you please.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the podcast that's not sweet, not salty, but it's a mix-up box.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. Uncork this podcast about 40 minutes before you want to listen to it and leave it on the side to aerate. You're in for a fruity treat. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast. We are the worm at the bottom of the tequila that is the internet.
Welcome to the creamiest, sweetest podcast on the internet. It's the coconut yogurt of the airwaves. It's the Off Menu Podcast.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, where we dip hot and crispy chat into cool humour. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, where we take the finest chat meat and smoke it with the wood of fun over an hour and then create the most wonderful, tender podcast available. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, biting into the sweet flesh of chat and spitting out the pips of truth. Hello, James Acaster.
And don't forget that when you listen to this podcast for about a day or so, your wee will smell weird. Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, the asparagus of the listening world.
Welcome to the Off Menu Podcast, lighting the firelighter of chat to stoke the barbecue of fun.
I'll take it.
100, baby!
100, baby!